What would you do if the person who once promised to love and protect you became the greatest threat to your life, and then escaped prison with one mission: to find you? On a quiet September evening in Gulfport, Mississippi, a woman named Cheryl sensed something was wrong. She had already taken steps to protect herself. A restraining order had been granted. Divorce papers had been filed. She was trying to rebuild her life for herself and her young son. Then she saw him. Her estranged husband was outside her home. She called police immediately. Officers responded, searched the area, and found nothing. For a brief moment, it seemed like the threat had passed. It hadn't. Later that night, he returned. This time, he forced his way inside. Cheryl ran to the bedroom where her child was, locked the door, and tried desperately to call 911. Before help could arrive, the door splintered open. A gun was pressed against her head. She and her son were forced into a vehicle. By morning, they were gone. Investigators quickly identified the suspect, a man who outwardly appeared disciplined and heroic. He had worked as a firefighter, trained in rescue diving, praised for bravery in emergencies. He understood survival. He understood pressure. But behind that image was a different reality. Cheryl had previously reported violent behavior. She had described escalating jealousy, control, and physical abuse. The divorce had shattered his ego. To him, it wasn't just separation, it was humiliation. When evidence showed that state lines had been crossed, the case was elevated to federal authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the investigation. Kidnapping that crosses state boundaries becomes a federal crime, and time is always the enemy. Days passed with no confirmed location. Then, unexpectedly, the suspect appeared at a scheduled court hearing for an unrelated shoplifting charge. Authorities were stunned. He was arrested on the spot. When questioned, he claimed Cheryl and their son were safe nearby. Officers located them alive, but visibly traumatized. Over the following days, Cheryl described a 3-day ordeal that investigators would later call a calculated campaign of terror. She had been assaulted, threatened repeatedly, and forced to contact her attorney to stop divorce proceedings. Their young son had been present during much of the abuse. The suspect, however, insisted it had been a voluntary trip. A family outing. A jury rejected that version. He was convicted of kidnapping, burglary, and aggravated assault. The sentence: 40 years in prison. He was transferred to the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. For most cases, that would be the end. But prison did not end his obsession. It refined it. Behind bars, he studied procedures. He observed routines. He cultivated relationships. Fellow inmates later described him as focused, patient, calculating, never impulsive. 2.5 years into his sentence, he found an opportunity. He befriended a younger inmate facing trial. Through manipulation, he convinced the inmate and his attorney that he could provide helpful testimony. Paperwork was filed. Transport was arranged. On the day of transfer, 2 officers escorted the inmates on a lengthy drive. They had handled prisoner transports before. They saw no immediate threat. During the trip, restraints were removed. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. At a routine stop, the inmates attacked. One officer was placed in a chokehold. The other was beaten. Weapons were seized. Both officers were restrained and left in a remote rural structure. The fugitives drove off in a stolen patrol vehicle, armed with multiple firearms. The following evening, a police captain in Tuscaloosa noticed something suspicious about an unmarked patrol car with visible damage. Trusting his instincts, he conducted a traffic stop. As he approached, a gunshot shattered the air. Then another. The captain was struck but survived by returning fire. The fugitives sped away again. The next day, another officer made a traffic stop in Moody, Alabama. Shots rang out once more. Officer Keith Turner was killed in the exchange. The situation had escalated from escape to murder. A massive manhunt began. Federal agents, state troopers, local deputies, and tactical units flooded the area. Helicopters scanned from above. K-9 teams searched wooded swamps and thick undergrowth. Checkpoints were established along major highways. Cheryl was immediately placed into protective custody. Agents were certain of one thing: his ultimate goal was not freedom, it was revenge. The fugitive demonstrated advanced survival tactics. He moved through streams to disrupt scent trails. He concealed himself in dense brush. He stole another vehicle. At one point, he forced a civilian at gunpoint to drive him south. The hostage survived through composure. He avoided confrontation, engaged the fugitive in calm conversation, and waited for a moment to escape. At a rest stop, he pretended to sleep. When the fugitive stepped away, he drove off and alerted authorities. Still determined, the fugitive persuaded an unsuspecting family to give him a ride. Media coverage had intensified. His face was everywhere. A tip led law enforcement to intercept the vehicle just miles from Cheryl's home. He surrendered without firing a shot. During interrogation, his words were chilling. He expressed anger toward Cheryl. He minimized his violence. He rationalized his actions. There was little acknowledgement of the officer who had been killed. Investigators believed the threat was finally neutralized. They were wrong. Months later, he escaped again. This time, he exploited emotional manipulation rather than force. A corrections officer had developed inappropriate communication with him. He shared personal stories. He positioned himself as misunderstood. He fostered sympathy. On the day of escape, he staged his bed to appear occupied. The officer remotely unlocked secured doors from her station. Without visible struggle or alarm, he walked out of jail. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were immediately notified. Schools went into precautionary lockdown. Cheryl was relocated yet again. Investigators traced letters he sent to the corrections officer after his escape. In those letters, he revealed enough detail about his movements to narrow the search. Surveillance teams eventually located him in the Atlanta area. Agents developed a plan designed to prevent further bloodshed. One officer staged a roadside distraction while others positioned themselves strategically. Within seconds, weapons were trained on him. He was pulled from a vehicle and placed in handcuffs. A loaded revolver, survival tools, and supplies were found nearby. He had been prepared for another extended flight. At trial for capital murder, he admitted to shooting Officer Turner but claimed self-defense. Prosecutors presented evidence showing he had initiated the violence. The jury delivered a guilty verdict. Years later, he was executed by lethal injection. He offered no final statement. For Cheryl and her son, it marked the end of a chapter defined by fear. For law enforcement, the case became a lasting lesson in risk assessment, professional boundaries, and the unpredictable nature of obsession. Investigators often reflect on the pivotal moments. The removed handcuffs, the misplaced trust, the emotional manipulation that breached secure doors. Each small decision created a chain reaction. But beyond procedural failures lies something deeper. At multiple points, he had choices. After the first act of violence, after the arrest, after sentencing, even after his first escape, he could have stopped. He didn't, and that raises a haunting thought. How many tragedies begin not with a single explosive act, but with a quiet decision to cross a line that once crossed becomes impossible to return from? Because in this case, the manhunt ended. But the question of where that line first disappeared remains unanswered.